like this.
Cool. Are we on?
Oh.
Okay, hi everybody. Maybe we could start this session. It's going to take the form of a sort of a little bit more informal fireside chat. I didn't know what a fireside chat was until a few days ago, but we're going to do one. Titled Counter AI Imaginaries. So we do have some slides of both Diana and my work, but we're just going to put them on rotation. It's not like we want to necessarily talk about them as like a lecture. So maybe I could just offer a few sentences about sort of how we want to frame the chat, and also to say that we don't necessarily, I think we will have a bit of time at the end, but it doesn't necessarily have to be like a typical Q&A. Feel free to just offer any thoughts or ideas that you have for the conversation as well. So yeah, I think we wanted to frame an event within the trade show around to think about artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms, these things, and how they're specifically being used in what we might call socially sensitive spaces. So thinking about this context over the last few years of algorithms and artificial intelligence used in what we might call predictive policing, where algorithms play a role in determining, predicting the risk of someone reoffending, and then that being used in their sentencing, or artificial intelligence being used in like the employment process, whether it's by selecting who gets selected for an interview, or how jobs are appraised today, sort of another domain. And also things like access to social benefits, who gets access to social housing, or who gets into a drug rehabilitation program. These things are increasingly being at least partly determined by artificial intelligence-driven algorithms. And so on the one hand, while it's really important work to sort of point out the harms that take place, and the sort of racial, gendered, classist kind of discriminations that can be enacted on different people and communities, we also want to think about like how do you contest these ideas well, contest these systems, think about is it possible, and how might it be possible for things like AI and technology to kind of serve more just futures as well, hence this kind of counter idea. So I'll introduce us. So I'm Catherine Gri. I am an assistant professor here at Taubman College, and I also have a joint appointment in the Digital Studies Institute at the university. And my research explores like critical algorithm studies, critical coding, kind of arts practice. And I more recently been looking at how machine learning applications are used in the workplace, specifically a type of like a new form of sort of physical bodily surveillance and the ethical contention in that. And then this is Diana Nucera, aka Mother Cyborg. Diana's a multimedia artist who uses quilts, performance, DIY publishing, and popular education methods to elevate collective technological consciousness and agency. Diana taps into the power of art media and technology to facilitate educational and emotional experiences. Her work draws from 14 years of community organizing in Detroit, Michigan, during which time she wrote guides and devised organizing models to fight digital redlining. In 2019, Diana was recognized with a Kresge Arts Literary Fellowship, and in 2020, she received a USC Annenberg Lab Civic Media Fellowship. And in 2021, she became a United States Artist Fellow in Media. And in 2022, she was awarded a Knight Art and Tech Fellowship, as well as a Rockefeller Bellagio Fellowship. So welcome, Diana. Thanks for braving the snow.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yeah, so maybe we could start thinking about your project, the People's Guide to AI.
Sure.
This kind of zine-like guidebook that Diana produced in collaboration with Mimi Onuoha. And yeah, maybe do you want to tell us about it? Or
Yeah. Just to kind of get a temperature check though. Folks familiar with the concepts of artificial intelligence out here? Like, are we all on the same page? Folks know what algorithms are, kind of, sort of, okay. So artificial intelligence generally uses algorithms, which are a series of steps. In the zine, we break that apart, and we break that apart by like looking at the different things that we do every day. So how we wake up in the morning and the algorithms that we naturally have, and then compare those to computer algorithms, and so on and so forth. So the zine is available online and it's free if you want to learn a little more, but just to kind of get us on the same page. In 2016, Mimi and I were brought to Maine to do this conversation around artificial intelligence, and at the time I was working on digital divide stuff in Detroit. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but Detroit in 2013 had 40% of its population with no internet connection at all, not even mobile. That's 40% of a city, a world-class city that came up with cars. It was like the center of technology at one point, has no internet connection. So that's the work I was working on. When I met Mimi, we were both in in this conversation around the harms and inequalities and just the major fear around the future of artificial intelligence. And I just remember thinking, like, how the hell am I going to tell people about this? How am I going to warn people about this if we don't even have the internet? You know, so like thinking about the different class divides that come with technology is something that's always been deep in my work. But also like once you know it, then what? So Mimi and I got together to actually come up with that booklet to then allow people to get an edge on that. And in creating that booklet, at the time, I don't know if folks were here, but there was a big water shutoff crisis that was happening in Detroit that was brought about by the Duggan administration, where like over 150,000 people got their water shut off. A lot of it was automated. Some people didn't necessarily like need to get their water shut off. Anyways, it was really intense. And because of that, there was a Hep A outbreak, and which didn't get a lot of reporting. And I tell you this story because when I met Mimi, I actually had developed Hep A. So we were having these conversations around the fear of artificial intelligence, the ways in which algorithms and all these systems can really harm us, and then I wake up in the hospital and these systems are keeping me alive. So from the get-go, you see the dichotomy of these systems and how they're both like advancing us while simultaneously harming us, and we're constantly trying to catch up to this point of understanding technology in order to then reshape it. So the guides, the work that I do is all about, and especially a People's Guide to AI, is about offering that head start so people can begin to shape the technology instead of react to it. And that's what you'll find across my whole work, is trying to offer that agency. And hopefully that makes sense. And yeah.
Yeah, one of the way that I first came into contact with your work was through that guide, because I started to use it in my classes here. So also teaching undergrads and grads, and trying to develop like a pedagogy or different courses that, on the one hand, we kind of read and we write and we theorize about these issues in the world, a kind of critical theory approach, but then how do you do that in a way where you can sort of touch a little bit of the technology as well and sort of poke and prod without necessarily being technologically trained, right? Without needing to be a computer scientist. So it's like, how do you bridge that a little bit? And so I partly use your guide in my class, and it's just interesting to think of it as like, on the one hand, for some students, they are its main audience, like they need to learn terminology and kind of ways of understanding how things work. And then on the other hand, you have, say, a computer science student who knows all of the terms, knows exactly how it works, but it kind of serves this other purpose of like being an artifact in itself, to sort of think about how it's organized and how it sort of facilitates access, right? Which I feel like is a big theme.
Yeah.
How do you engage broader publics in a conversation about artificial intelligence that is otherwise very technically obfuscated, in order to have this conversation of like, how do we want to live with AI? How do we not want to live with AI?
And also seeing how it's connected in ways that we're not expecting. So going from automated water shutoffs, right, to like systems in hospitals that keep us alive, to policing that you were saying, but also terminology like that we know. So there's so much in ways that like digital technologies are connected in our day-to-day that we're just completely unaware of or we take for granted. And I think that's why it's really important to have access and to be able to demystify some of this stuff, because without that language, what are you gonna, how are you gonna stand up for yourself?
Yeah. And I think one thing that the guidebook also brings up is like the way it relates, like lots of examples that relate to different life experiences, right? So like trying to understand AI from the perspective of, or from the lens of what your own lived experience is. So if you grow up in a community that's highly policed, your perspective of sort of policing and artificial intelligence is going to be different to someone that grew up in a community that was not over-policed and they sort of feel quite safe. So I feel like it's interesting way of like we don't always often think of technology and sort of our lived experience and how that kind of informs our opinion of it.
And how it creates the complexity of the word safety. Like safety might seem like, put your seatbelt on, keep it cute, you're gonna be safe in the storm. But also a camera. Makes some people feel incredibly safe, but others feeling policed. And in some research that I was able to do when I worked at the Detroit Community Technology Project is that you see that safety means completely different things based on those contexts that you're talking about. So for marginalized communities, safety is often regarded to body and to health, whereas in more privileged communities, it's around material things. And so you could see the difference between how a camera can keep someone who has material things safe, but is not very good at keeping a body safe. Only in the aftermath. It doesn't prevent bodily harm.
Yeah. Safety. Another word maybe that your guide expands is like intelligence, right? So it kind of offers these other conceptions of intelligence and kind of points out how AI really embodies only one, or simulates one type of human intelligence. And then there's all these other types of human intelligence. I feel like that really sort of resonates with students, this sort of more like embodied intelligence, musical intelligence, I can't remember the other ones.
Or empathy, I think that the thing that feels scarier and scarier is that how much more we want to automate systems and how hard it is for computers to understand the nuances of life. Like, just think about the amount of emotions that you've felt in the past, hour, and how do you turn that into data for a computer to be able to read and do a series of steps with? Like, as things start to increase to be much more automated, those those nuances kind of get pushed aside, and you get the cracks that people kind of fall through get bigger and bigger, and create even more of disparity, which I think is really intense. And that's why we brought up these different intelligences. Like, what are we training these computers to do to be more efficient? What about happiness? Can you train a computer to support happiness? Or we often play a game in it's called Algorithms in Social Spaces, where folks are tasked with creating an algorithm that finds the most fun and interesting people using public data. And wow, the arguments of like what makes someone fun and what makes someone interesting often creates a really fun environment. But how do you train a computer to do that? So just thinking about like once these automated systems get into more social spaces, you have a lot more issues and a lot more discrepancies take place.
Yeah, I think, and that it kind of leads us into, this, how do we reclaim technology as a tool of liberation, right? It's not really, I feel almost daily now we have these headlines of artificial intelligence, whether it's language models or image models or autonomous decision-making systems in sensitive domains, that definitely we don't live, that narrative is not sort of positive anymore. It feels kind of always contending with some kind of risk or harm or sort of lack of foresight as to where sort of something could go. So maybe we could just talk about like I feel like the People's Guide to AI is definitely like one of these contesting practices, the way it facilitates teaching and workshops, or even like how do you speak to a much older generation of people for which AI might be much more difficult to deal with or difficult to understand.
Different, because I feel like older generations, when they think about artificial intelligence, they're more thinking about robots and are traumatized by the robots coming into the car companies and stealing their jobs. And so that, like, I think about that trajectory of like our fear of technology moving from like, will it replace us? Is it gonna get sentient and kill us?
Yeah.
To like, oh no, I'm gonna get lost in the mix of the data, So it's like that evolution of fear too, also continuing to change is really interesting to me. But.
Yeah. Well, maybe it kind of relates to something that I've worked on in research and a little bit in classes. So I spent some time researching a very particular suite of algorithms that are quite technical. They come direct, like prototypes that come directly out of a computer science lab as kind of, very much like frontier kind of research. And they're ones that like track the body using surveillance cameras and are able to sort of in quite intricate detail survey the body and attempt to predict its actions, its movements, and it's been applied in workplaces as a way of connecting very particular bodily movements to productivity, right? And if you look at some of the, like thinking about using the methodology of like what I would call critical code studies, where we think about source code also as like a cultural text that should be available to us to interpret differently to how a computer would interpret it. And so when you look at some of the source code and the kind of a taxonomy of activities that these things were built around, like I found one prototype that was differentiating, say, a worker on a construction site or in a factory, I'm thinking about like the automotive context, where, say you pick up some materials and carry it across the site, that's one activity that can be recognized. Or you kind of, maybe you're welding something, right? But then there's all these other little behaviors embedded in the model. So it can also say when you pick up a bottle of water and drink the water, and when you wipe perspiration from your brow, it's able to distinguish that. And of course, if you dig into the way the model like weights things, wiping perspiration is unproductive, and welding is productive, right? So I was always interested in that, like using critical code studies to kind of look at a scientific artifact to like kind of show how there really is like a kind of set of like values and choices inside the way technology is built. Sometimes people say, oh, it's just been it's just been applied in the world incorrectly. Like it was built in a neutral way and it's been applied in an incorrect way. But I think it's an interesting example to think about like the future of work and artificial intelligence and this idea of this old idea that technology is supposed to like liberate the body from the arduousness of work, but then you have these systems that also really reveal like a politics and an ethics in the way it kind of wants to treat the body in the workplace.
Yeah.
And I
would never want a computer to be my boss.
Oh yeah, and that's the other thing.
That would be, and why do we say that? Because like, what do you mean like wiping my brow is not productive? You know, like, and to think about like productivity as the most valuable thing for work, I think is such a capitalistic thing, you know, like it's just very extractive in the sense of like what the body is even capable of doing, you know, what our brains are capable of doing, what our hands are capable of doing. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up.
So yeah, but what I was also wanted to link it to was another kind of counter practice, another sort of practice of contestation I see is this thing that I kind of broadly frame as counter data. So, and I always think about Mimi Onuoha's project. Mimi Onuoha is an artist who's working with AI, and she has a project called the Library of Missing Data Sets. It's kind of a few years old now, but it's really been embraced by a lot of kind of people in the critical technology space, because I guess it really kind of gets to something in such a kind of beautiful way. But it's like a physical installation of one of these old-fashioned kind of office filing cabinets, and you sort of open the drawer, and there's all of these paper folders in with sort of labels that are effectively the titles of a data sets. And when you open the files there, they're empty, right? So it's like this library of data sets that don't exist. And I think it's a really good example of this move towards like a counter data, like how artists, designers, activists, like local community groups are sort of trying to like rethink data sets. And all of the different strategies that people use, because that's definitely like one intervention, is rethinking the data on which algorithms are trained, especially machine learning algorithms are trained on.
And what data can reveal? So currently, why that's so radical is that you have data feeding computers to create these automated systems to then help us be more efficient or to surveil us, right? And what Catherine's talking about with Mimi's work is that you could also have data kind of reveal the discrepancies that we are dealing with, and like they become proof of structural racism. They become proof of like extraction within capitalism, which I think is really powerful, because sometimes it's hard to have tech do that because technology is designed to be profitable in some sense. Like every way in which every tool that we have is a product that creates some kind of either generative data or of some kind of profit for another company. There's a saying that is like, if it's free, then you're the product, which I know is like contended, but it's like very true in a sense. It's like if everything that you do is incredibly important for a computer to understand, so that collection of data is more valuable than gold and oil combined. So keep that in mind every time you click away. But why the arts is in this field and so important is because it actually shows like how you turn that around. How can data be liberatory? Like, sure, we could use it to find things that aren't there. We could use it, like I said before, for some evidence. But then I do think there's some ways of imagining that can happen. So I have this quilt. It's not here, but I call it the data stream. And it really makes me think about, when I was making it, I was thinking about all the little fragments of our lives that future generations will have, and that we're like a generation that is the most documented, with like, then, I mean, people are gonna have so much information about us if the internet stays the way it is, that it's kind of wild to think about. Like, and think about like 100 years ago, trying to like understand what some of your ancestors were doing. Like, you're putting the pieces together of what their everyday lives were. Like, literally our everyday life, we offer it to people. It's somehow it's recorded, if it's not by our own consent, by these cameras that Catherine's talking about. So what does it even mean to have a generation completely documented like that? And my big question is like, what then does that data show us? Like, what will they know about us now that we can't even fathom about ourselves? And that fascinates me too. So like there are these opportunities, like data's not all bad. There are opportunities to learn. It could be a reflective tool. It could be a liberation tool in those senses. But the issue is the way in which we think about it. It's the issues of how we use it. And I always go back to the simplest thing, which is that like there are intrinsic values in these systems that are put in by humans, right? And so that's why people fight to have diversity at the table so that there are multiple perspectives when doing this work, right? But I don't even think that's enough. I don't think that we're able to kind of move ourselves out of what we are experiencing right now, and what I'll just say blatantly is structural racism. It is incredibly hard to think outside of that when that's all you know. So I'm fascinated by how data and even artificial intelligence systems can think outside of that system for us. And I'm wondering, I've always wondered if that could be a tool as well.
Yeah, it's really tricky, isn't it? Because you play a very sensitive line between what so many people criticize as techno-positivism, like, or AI for social good, where sort of AI is kind of specifically designed to kind of solve what we might all agree on to be important problems to solve, but they do so by massively maybe reducing the complexity of something.
Yeah.
So yeah, I find that really tricky to talk about.
Yeah. It's kind of like you have to be like outside of the planet to see the planet as a whole. Like
Yeah.
you could never talk about the whole because you are part of the whole. I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyways, it's a different talk.
Well, it would be great to hear more about your quilts, but maybe we can come back to that.
Sure.
I was thinking about, just picking up a bit more on the Library of Missing Data Sets project, and how you were saying, like, what it really does as a device is like highlight how data is inherently a kind of political medium, if you like. What the data that doesn't exist is as important to think about as the data that does exist, even though we are not kind of used to that framework of thinking. And like in the People's Guide to AI, you point out how the intelligences that AI doesn't simulate are also as important to think about as the one type of intelligence it does simulate. And so in a way, you sort of putting in this kind of world that feels very kind of saturated with data and so maybe technological solutions, it's also important to think about like what we lose in those solutions, like what intelligence gets lost. And even maybe go as far as to say like what aspects of our humanity are getting lost in the inability or the sort of focus on algorithms and their particular logics, or that one particular logic or system. So I guess I just wanted to point out as well, like some other practices that I think people have for this. So like there's Mimi's project, but there's also work that's being done in like a critical data space that's, I think of this person called Diana Nucera. He's like a critical data person, and he develops projects that often, he asks that we, instead of talking about data sets, we talk about data settings. And it's this idea that how do you always retain the idea of place and origin, of locality in data? So on the one hand, there's this kind of desire to think of data set like a global data set, right? Or like big data, or we constantly hear about like ChatGPT is now supposedly trained on the whole of the internet any information that passed through it, right? This idea of a sort of global data set. And I think it's really interesting, this counter approach that thinks about data as sort of locality, origin, local communities. And so there's all of these other practices that are like what we might call activist data sets, or like even data sets that are created specifically to antagonize an issue, or what other ideas are there? it definitely, like Lucas's work definitely connects to the sort of desire to decolonize things, decolonize data. And so he talks about how, data should never be disconnected. Data always has a source. But we kind of live in this world where we want to sort of abstract it from source, from its kind of place of locality, from who collected it, why they collected it, who funded its collection, and sort of abstract it into this just big pot, melting pot of data where algorithms are allowed to just sort of generate their own patterns amongst it, right? Disconnected from our kind of origins.
It's like the blood diamond, if it becomes, like, we don't think about where these precious gems come from until you hear the story of the blood diamond, I guess, That's what you brought up for me. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, right, I hadn't heard that story.
I don't want you to sound so smart right now. I don't want
Yeah, so I also use this approach a little bit in teaching. I don't know, where I sometimes ask students to create, as an exercise, to create their own data set. I usually work with vision systems, so it's often like a visual data set, like an image-based data set, as also like a technique to learn become a little bit familiar with some simple programming practices. And so also thinking, it opens up the space to thinking about like all the artists in the world that create data as well. So artistic data, subjective data, data sets that have been created around like, what might you call them? Sort of like, I don't want to say effective data because that's a whole other computational field, but like emotional data sets, so something like that. I also see as like this trend of contestation of these practices. Okay, so maybe you do want to talk a bit more about your quilts work?
Oh,
yeah,
sure.
As a practice?
Yeah.
Because Diana had a solo show at the Stamps Gallery in Ann Arbor. Was it last year?
Yeah, it was in summer
which
last year.
are showing some of these kind of really large-scale physical quilts.
Yeah, so why quilts? Like, how are we going to go from algorithms to quilts? I will take you through that journey. The time was 2020, and there was a pandemic. Basically, that's the end of story. Okay, so I've spent 13 years of my life working digital divide stuff and digital equality in Detroit, Michigan. I'm primarily working on the internet connection piece, building our own wireless networks and creating the concept that like neighborhoods could actually be their own internet service providers. And that work is still continuing without me. I haven't been in that work for about 5 years now, but I'm happy to say that these networks now own their own fiber and are kicking ass, which is very cool. So if you're not familiar, like owning your own fiber is like major. It's like owning this building and U of M rents from you. So that's very cool. So like all that work was incredibly hard, and it took decades. It was like 13 years of hard work, and in the midst included policy work. Like we fought hard for net neutrality. We fought hard for like all this stuff, and then Trump comes along and like tears it all up, and then like, what is it worth anyways? So it was rough times, right? But we still prevailed, and people have their internet connections, and we became a model for how people could actually, fight for their own internet and create their own internet, which is very exciting. It burnt me out. It burnt me out so incredibly hard that I literally it took 3 years to heal from. And I say that because we often praise people for breaking through a glass ceiling, but we don't consider all the cuts that kind of happen along the way once you break through that. And so I was like bleeding out. But I'm good now, thank you. And well, what I did was I was just like, I need to like just use my hands instead of my head. So I started quilting in the midst of the pandemic, and gardening. And I was really thinking about my garden as like almost like a node within a mesh network. How can this also be a place of healing, a place of connectivity. So really moving away from the digital into the most analog possible. Came across quilting and just was like, what do I do with all this information I learned? Like, we literally learned how to build our own internet service provider. I could tell you exactly how the internet works, all the business behind it. What do you do with all that information, right? So I put it into quilts. And I was like, there's so much complexity here, especially with the data extraction that's happening, especially with the rise of algorithms and all that, and thinking about access and legacy. And quilting is an incredibly old form of organizing. It's been used specifically in this country as a way of survival for women, for people of color. I mean, you may have heard about the Underground Railroad quilts that like guided people to safe places. Quilting has a legacy of as a people's movement. And so it felt right. And I've been sewing since I was a kid. I grew up amongst many tailors. So these quilts that you're seeing here are like looking at how do you put the complexities of technology in the most analog form possible so people can have a safe space in which to contemplate these complexities. Because at the time, I was reading Shoshana Zuboff's Age of Surveillance Capitalism, which if you have read that, maybe you too needed therapy after, because it's intense. You're just basically like, oh my God, like I am just, it's like you just have these like data just coming off of you and like Google eating it. Like it's wild. It's a wild book to read. It took me 6 months. It was wild. So these quilts were reflecting on that, because like, what do you do? What do you do when you have the things that connect you to each other, to your loved ones, are the things that are harming you as well? And I refuse to give up Instagram. I love it too much. It's super fun. It's the way, I share I refuse to give up my phone. I refuse to be fearful of these things, because they connect me to my loved ones. They allow me to explore my identity, my sexuality, everything. And so that's the place I stand, and wanted to be like, people need to also, but know what's happening. So, can we stop on some of the quilts?
Yeah.
So I'll just give you a sense of like, okay, how does this work when you're like thinking about like how digital translates into here we go, yeah, excellent. Okay, so this one in particular, clearly using ones and zeros as a way of saying we're talking about tech, because of the matrix, it's just like, and this is an infinity loop or a Celtic cross, or it's an image that comes across many different cultures, and it symbolizes love and connectivity. And what I was doing here was trying to really think about like, okay, like how do we even combat a system that is commodifying love? So every like, every heart, every way in which we comment on each other, that's the extraction that happens. So this to me is really, really intense, because like, as I said before, I refuse to give up these tools because they are how I feel and express love. And I have no idea how one combats a system that is commodifying love. It is incredibly scary to me. So I didn't know what to do besides put these up and make them beautiful to think about. You go to the next one. Okay, and then this one, so I started using boxes as a way of identity, thinking about how our data is put into boxes, how we are these units, and was trying to understand like, what does the system look like? How all these things that we're talking about are invisible. They're just kind of like words, concepts. So for me, creating a visual language around it became very important to then make it tactile. So this quilt's called the system, and it's actually trying to look at just how this all works together. Like, here's my community, here's the data crunchers around eating all of our stuff. There's a power dynamic between, like things are top heavy. But if you notice in the top left corner, or is that left left or right, top right corner, there's some stars that don't quite align. There's like a box that's all blue. There's these moments that don't fully connect. And for me, this quilt became a way of looking at how there's always something that will crash the system. There's always an anomaly. And I learned that through building these internet networks and saying that, like, people told us, you can't build your own internet. We did. We built 3 of them. And, and they're still going, And so I wanted to create something that also, like, reflected, like, this is an incredibly complex system, but it is not perfect. And the job that we actually have, the agency we have, is to look for these anomalies and to just, like, exploit them and to, like, tear them apart. And so these quilts were a way of healing. They were a way of reflecting, and they were a way of creating a visual language that would then allow for deeper thinking around tech outside of just, like, intellectual spaces as for people to reflect. So hopefully that makes sense.
Do you want to say anything about the others?
Sure, this one's called The Platforms Are Segregating Us. I made this during the 2020 election, looking at how Facebook and Twitter played such a huge role in getting Trump elected, and how manipulative that was, and how both analog and digital platforms really keep us from seeing eye to eye. And I wanted something visual that could really express what that complexity, and a lot of people say this reminds them of the game Q*bert. So yeah, all the 80s babies, I see you. Yeah, and I think that's the power of art and craft in particular, is that they allow us to, they allow us to just see things in other perspectives, but also to simplify what's complex in order to then have a little more interaction with it. And so that's the purpose of these quilts. The show was called Crafting Our Digital Legacy because I do feel that we actually are able to craft the future and the legacy that we have ahead of us. And this was like a way of, again, trying to build agency with technology in the most analog way possible.
I'll just move it over while we can just...
Oh, the thing inside of the thing. This one's 3D. This one was deep in Shoshana's book. Oh my God. When I look at it, I'm like triggered. I'm like, oh my God. But really, it was looking at how there's really like a VPN, a firewall, all these fancy words to like protect you, to keep you safe. They don't work. This quilt will work as much to protect you as your VPN will. I mean, it will let you watch Hulu in another country, but that's about it. And that reality really kicked in. I was just like, wow, I could put all of these protectors on my phone, but there's always something inside of something else that's collecting my data. And I'm still to this day trying to grapple with that. Like, as someone who refuses to give these connections up, knowing all this stuff, like where do we go from here? So that's kind of what this series of quilts were. It was just like, let's just look at it all. Let's look at the anomalies and see what comes from there.
I find it really fascinating and beautiful how like your work just spans the scale across like community organizing and like literally installing internet infrastructure for a large part of a city, to just thinking about your own relationship with technology and society in these very kind of material, intricate, like historical kind of medium. That's, really fascinating.
Thanks for seeing me. I mean, you'll see the through line is education. Like the whole thing, like the reason why the internet networks worked was because I knew how to teach. People ask me all the time, I actually don't know how to build a network. I know how to teach how to build one though. I do think that's the thing, education, and like you'll see with the People's Guide to AI, it's breaking that information down so you feel like you could actually shift these systems is a huge part of my work, whether it be a book or a quilt. It's all based in education.
Yeah. So we have a little bit more time left. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to talk about, or if anyone else would like
let's
to
open it up if
jump
people
in
want to
with
chat.
thoughts. It doesn't have to be questions. It can be just interests, or I don't know, pushback.
A resistance manual? They're all
Another
resistance
one.
manuals.
Is there another one?
Oh, okay. Yes. Okay, so Mimi and I started a small press called A People's Guide to Tech. We finally have a website up. We have a new book that recently just came out, which you can get there. It's a handbook on digital ID systems, which hasn't quite gotten to the States, but will eventually. We also have a book coming out called Towards a Future of Tech, which shares all these principles and ways of thinking about technology for the future, and a guide to the internet. So yes, there's many things. This is a big year for the press. We're coming out, so like sign up, go to our website, all that stuff. But yes, resistance manuals every year, all the time. Oh yeah.
Sorry. No, it just, firstly, lovely work. And it just reminded me that, there's always this kind of small tipping point when things get really violent maybe in some societies, right? And I think there was this whole thing in Canada, I think, around culture jamming, where people were going around, maybe inspired by Fight Club, smashing sort of television signals, antenna and stuff like that. So it's kind of, if one is able to visualize this invisible infrastructure that's surveilling, and on a flashpoint, it's quite violently dismantled at some point. And it'll be lovely to have a manual that you know what to look out for and what to dismantle as soon as you.
I don't condone violence. However, I do appreciate subversion, and and as you can't tell, yes, I grew up in like the 90s as an anarchist for sure. So yeah, that's part of it. But yeah, I actually think you can really change these systems, and it doesn't have to be violent. And I think that's what's really exciting about the internet, is because a post can make a ripple. That's pretty amazing. So thanks for bringing that up. Ooh, yes.
Audience, and especially on Instagram, because I feel the same way as you do about Instagram specifically, because I got it when I was in high school, and I've had a pretty tenuous relationship with it, but I do feel like right now is kind of the most comfortable and the most productive I've been with the app. But there has been that shift from like a chronological timeline to an algorithmic timeline, and I figured that, or at least I found that that's really disrupted is my relationship to my audience. So like, who's actually seeing what I'm making, and how can I get better access to them? Because when I hear about what you've said about commodifying these relationships, I found that at this point, where Meta is moving is just simply paying for greater access. And the last thing that I want to add to that is sort of when I see your work as well, the 0-1s sort of serve as this, not universal, but I think pretty much anyone, regardless of how educated they are, understand that 0-1 refers to binary code. And then layered on top of it are these sort of fractal and geometric, I would call them like signals. So I'm really curious kind of like who is that for, and like who are you speaking to directly, and how wide is that gamut? If that makes sense.
Well, thank you for showing up with your amazing outfit. I just want to honor that. I respect that. Yeah, okay, so this is where I think my pseudonym comes into play, Mother Cyborg. I'm a queer woman which grew up in the House of Chanel, which is based here in Ann Arbor. I think about the role of a mother, specifically in queer culture, is to mentor, not necessarily, and house, but create a safe space in which for people to grow into themselves. And so when I think about my audience as Mother Cyborg, that's exactly how I feel, is to create a nurturing space, whether it be online or off, for people to be able to come into themselves and to mentor them around the potential and harms of technology. Now, I know that sounds kind of wild, but and maybe it doesn't sound wild, but I think that's what I have to do in order not to feel like I'm selling myself online, or promoting myself online, because I found that relationship to be really hard and extractive, and I'm not always sharing my work. I do expect people to kind of find me, which is not the best for the promotion, but I like things to be organic and to be slow. So I don't have a target audience. I have more of a desire to gather a diaspora of cyborgs that deeply care about the future of technology. And that might be you, that might be you, that might not be anybody here, but I don't, when I think about it, I think about it as a mother. I don't have children other than my baby DJs in Detroit, who you might know about, but I think about it as a deity, supporting, gathering people to go and do the thing. Yeah, and hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you.
Yeah. And don't forget to ask Catherine questions too, because she had lots of cool things to say.
Can I? Yeah, so one of the things that I found really refreshing, I guess, in the conversation of technology, I guess in this panel, was there seems to be an embrace of both kind of an optimistic side to technology, while at the same time the fear was kind of very clear, right? I came across this science fiction writer that was talking about how we're kind of both living the apocalypse. Like China Mayville talks about how we are living both the apocalypse and a utopia at the same time. He calls this kind of utopialypsis or something kind of. Cool. And in a way, I feel a little bit that we are operating in that space, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems that your work embodies that sense of contradiction in a way between the optimistic side that technology might offer, but also the fearful kind of all the fears that we have of what this technology might kind of provoke, right? So I wonder, how do you reconcile that kind of situation and the anxiety almost that emerge from this dual condition?
Yeah, the anxiety, yeah. Anti-anxiety meds? I don't know. Microdosing? I don't know. So I feel like so where the enthusiasm for tech comes out of, I think comes from my queerness, because as a young person growing up in small town Indiana, the internet is all I had. I mean, mind you, I didn't get the internet till I was a junior in high school, but once I got it, I knew I loved it. I was like, wow, this is how I find my people. We were organizing shows, we were following bands, we were going to raves. It was like my life became, I became. I found freedom that way. So it was incredibly informative to me as someone who's an outsider. Fast forward to the internet work I've been doing now, and watching the transformation of a neighborhood because of an internet connection that was provided by another neighbor is incredibly inspiring. I mean, I've seen technology liberate people across the world. I've had the honor of teaching people many places how to do this work, and it's really amazing. And I think that's where I get my enthusiasm and my positivity, is that I've literally witnessed it as a form of transformation, as a form of relationship. I've witnessed it as a liberatory tool. However, I know how it's oppressed me as well. And I think since we are in like a creative school, like that is the power of the critique, right? Is that constructive criticism will move you to the next place of your work. It'll move you to become clearer. It'll move you to become have more inquiry on what you're doing. And so I think the two combined balance each other out in a way where it's like, we can't just pretend like everything was fine and we're just gonna make it better, because our ideas come from this place of where it wasn't fine. So there's all this like reconditioning that needs to take place, that I think that has to happen in a space of joy, or else it just repeats the harms, right? So I don't know how else to say it other than that constructive criticism really can move creativity, and I do think there's liberation within creativity, and technology is incredibly creative. So hopefully that answers your question.
We good?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Diana, for joining
Thank you
us
so
through the trip. And thanks for being here.